If you've ever set foot in a business class, you've definitely met them. The 4 foundational principles of management. You know the ones: plan, lead, organize, and control. They're always presented as this kind of settled law, right? The absolute bedrock of management education. But what if I told you this clean, simple framework has a secret history? A really chaotic, 50-year-long academic brawl that nearly tore the whole discipline apart? Okay, let's get into it.
So on one side, you have the axiom. It's what we all learn in the textbooks. It's neat, it's logical, it's crystal clear. But on the other side, well, that's the reality of where it came from. A period of such intense academic confusion that one scholar, Harold Kuntz, famously dubbed it the management theory jungle. And trust me, it was a total mess of competing schools, conflicting ideas, and just semantic chaos.
So, that brings us to the crucial question, right? How in the world did management as a field of study fight its way out of that jungle? How did we manage to transform decades of academic chaos into the universal framework that pretty much every business student learns today? Well, that's the mystery we're going to solve in this explainer.
To get to the bottom of it, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at that messy past hiding behind our modern axiom. Then, we're going to uncover the detective work used to piece this whole history together. We'll dive into the core findings, which is really a story of 3 stable principles and 1 highly contested 4th one. We'll see how it was all forged by 3 distinct historical eras, and then finally, we'll land on a pretty surprising conclusion about what this framework really is, and more importantly, what it means for future scholars like us.
You know, this story really kicks off with Henri Fayol. Back in 1917, he was the first to really name the functions of management. But his initial spark didn't just create an instant consensus. Oh no. Instead, it ignited a debate that would absolutely rage for over 50 years, from the 1930s all the way to the 1980s, as scholars just battled to define the very soul of management. So you might be wondering, how can we be so sure about this messy history? Well, our understanding comes from this really rigorous 2-part methodology that's outlined in the source journal for this explainer. It's best to think of the researchers as historical detectives, and their investigation involved 2 key steps, which we're about to explore.
The investigation had 2 main parts. First up, a massive historiographic review, which is basically a super deep dive into the textbooks themselves, and that tells us what changed over time. But to really understand why it all changed, they added a second layer of analysis called critical hermeneutics, and that is what lets us understand the context happening behind the words on the page.
And when I say the scale of that first step was massive, I mean it. The researchers analyzed over 260 management textbooks, published between 1935 and 2013. By systematically tracking how the principles were presented across generations of these books, they could literally map out exactly what changed and, just as importantly, when.
But here, this is where the detective work gets really insightful. That second step, critical hermeneutics, is the key that unlocks the why. It means the researchers didn't just count the principles. They asked, why did they change? They looked at the cultural shifts, the political pressures, and the economic forces that were shaping what academics were writing and what students were being taught. This is how we get from the what to the so what.
And that incredible 2-part analysis led to a total breakthrough finding. When they mapped the evolution of the principles over time, they found that not all 4 of them had the same history, not even close. In fact, there was a really clear split.
So, 3 of the principles were remarkably stable: planning, organizing, and controlling. They show up in some form right from the very beginning, and they stay pretty consistent through that entire 50-year debate. And this makes perfect sense, right? They were rooted in the scientific era of Taylor and Fayol, a period that was obsessed with efficiency, measurement, and precision. These were the hard, kind of mechanical parts of management.
But the entire 50-year battle, the absolute core of the management theory jungle, was fought over the 4th principle. It was a debate centered entirely on the human element. It started with Fayol's command and coordinate, then it evolved into directing in the 50s, shifted over to motivating in the 60s, and didn't finally land on leading until the 1980s. This timeline is a perfect map of the changing view of the worker in the American workplace.
You know, during this whole debate, a few other principles even made some guest appearances. Staffing was pretty popular for about 2 decades, especially as research started focusing on middle management, but it was eventually just absorbed back into the organizing function. Decision-making also had its moment in the late 60s before it got folded into the planning process. These ghost principles are like little clues to the ongoing struggle for a clean, simple framework.
Okay, so we know what happened. But remember that second step in the methodology, the critical hermeneutics? That's what lets us understand why.
The consensus didn't just magically appear out of thin air, it was forged in the crucible of three very distinct historical eras.
So these three eras, they each contributed a vital piece of the puzzle. The scientific era gave us our stable foundation: plan, organize, and control. Then the human relations movement came along and completely redefined the human element, which made leading pretty much inevitable. And finally, that period of emerging from the jungle was all about the external pressures that forced academia to finally agree on a single framework.
This quote from Kuntz just captures the problem perfectly. By 1961, the explosion of research from psychology, sociology, economics, it had created this dense jungle of theories. There was no unifying map, and academics from different disciplines literally couldn't even understand each other. So a clear, teachable framework wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was an absolute necessity for the field to even survive.
Okay, so this is the crucial point. Why did leading win out as the fourth principle? Well, two major post-war cultural forces really drove this change. First, the Cold War. The American preference for anything anti-Soviet translated into a desire for democratic ideals like individualism and autonomy in the workplace. The idea of just commanding workers felt really outdated. And second, the workforce itself was changing. Between 1930 and 1970, college enrollment nearly quadrupled. A more educated workforce demanded more responsibility and more meaningful work. They didn't want to be directed, they wanted to be led.
The chaos of the jungle might have just kept going, but an external threat forced a resolution. In the 1970s and 80s, rising economic competition from Japan created this intense pressure. Academics and practitioners alike needed a clear, coherent, and teachable American framework so they could compete on the global stage. The need for a unified front finally ended all the internal debates.
So, after all this historical detective work, what's the final verdict? What are the four principles of management, really? Well, the conclusion is both incredibly simple and really profound.
So, what are they? The evidence points to a surprising conclusion. They aren't a scientific theory discovered and proven by a single researcher. They are a teaching framework, a practical tool that was born out of sheer necessity. Think of it like a treaty, not a discovery. Academics, publishers, and educators all agreed on this framework because they needed a clear map to help them navigate the chaos of the management theory jungle. It was a pragmatic solution, not some singular stroke of genius.
And you know, that conclusion isn't an endpoint. For an audience of scholars, it's a beginning. It actually opens up entirely new and exciting lines of inquiry, challenging us to look at our field's history with totally fresh eyes. Because if the four principles are a framework that was created by consensus, it forces us to ask a really important question. What and who got left out? What crucial ideas and alternative perspectives were smoothed over or just discarded in that pursuit of this clean, teachable model?
The source journal points to some really specific opportunities here. You know, many of the scholars who were engaged in that original 50-year debate are still available for interviews. Capturing their personal recollections is a chance to save a piece of our discipline's memory before it's gone for good. And even more importantly, we need to explore the contributions of non-Western thinkers, like Thomas Bada of the former Czechoslovakia, whose ideas about workshop autonomy and profit sharing actually predated similar Western theories by decades.
Ultimately, the story of the four principles isn't just about the past. It's a powerful reminder that even our most foundational concepts are not set in stone. They are human constructs with complex, messy, and totally fascinating histories. And that leaves all of us with a critical challenge. What other settled theories in our field are just waiting for their own secret history to be told?